Hello, Rebecca. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the Internal Communication Spotlight series, which I am running on my blog. Again, this with thought leaders to understand their perspectives on various topics like culture, like executive presence, and it's great to have you on the show to talk about stakeholder management. So before we get started, it'll be great if you could quickly introduce yourself for our viewers.
Sure. So my name is Rebecca Sangster-Kelly. I am a management consultant who specializes in communications, and I work with, currently one of my clients is a VP level, so working with them to help them communicate with their stakeholders and their teams, but also helping their teams reach their audience. So helping someone switch their perspective in order to achieve their objectives.
Great, fantastic. And I know this is a understudied or under discussed subject, stakeholder management in terms of internal comms per se. So what's your understanding of stakeholder management? How do you define it?
So I define stakeholder management as mapping different groups or people against topics or changes that are of interest to them or they can influence. So in any topic, you can have people who have more or less influence or power or interest or impacted by. And it's about how does this impact them. I also like looking at it when I'm working with clients of looking at who's the most interested, impacted, or who has influence, because you have the people who will be taking in the changes, taking in the message, and then you have people that you can leverage to promote. So people who have that leadership, either official leadership or social leadership, and help you achieve your goal with what you want to achieve with your communications. And it's also just because it's sometimes when we do comms, it's about, we feel like we just like, okay, we got the message out there. We have so much else to do. But it is the life cycle of the message. And if you don't do stakeholder management, you're missing the opportunity to have a better impact.
Fantastic. That's a great way to kind of describe the area. So why is it so important for communicators? What's your thinking around it?
Well, I look at communications is not a static activity. It's dynamic, it's engagement. I look at communications like a dance. You go one way and then you hope the other person does too. And you're feeling where you're going so that you're moving in unison. And unless you have stakeholder management intact, you're just breakdancing and you're hoping the person's going to respond. Right. Whereas if you're like doing the cha-cha-cha, you want to be in sync because you need to move from one point of the floor to the other. And to get to it, it's all about achieving the strategic goal. What do you want to achieve in the end? And without the stakeholder management of your audiences driving to ensure that they have the same understanding, you're speaking into a void, and it's going to be quite boring.
I like that. And so what according to you are some of the key elements of stakeholder management?
So there's some handy frameworks, especially if you go on Google, and if you look up a stakeholder matrix, and I recognize because we're just doing video, I can't show you this matrix, but it's a very common one, and it's a 2x2 grid, and it on the y-axis you have power and influence, and on the x-axis you have interest or impact. And with these four squares, you have at the least interested and least power or influence as monitor. So you just want to make sure that those are the tick in the box people. Like, they've got their email. They're not going to cause you any trouble. They don't care, but they're there. And then next up, if they power but not interested, you want to keep them satisfied. So they have some skin in the game because they have power and influence over it, but you just need to make sure they're informed and keep a tabs on where they're at to make sure if their interest goes up, you're ready for it. Because if they have power, they could derail you, and you don't want that. With increased interest but less power influence, you have to keep informed. Or sometimes they're called in the squares the defenders. So they're people who can cause you more grief if they're not brought along the journey because they have a lot of interest, right, but they feel stifled because they can't do anything about it. So you need to make sure that their input is heard, that they feel that they're a part of the journey, that they're being taken into account. And then in the top corner where you have more power and the most interest, you have to manage closely, because those people are the enthusiastic ones who can go and off and do their own thing, and you lose control of your message. Because overall, it's like, what's happening with your message? How's it doing? And you can use those people to promote your message, but it takes that relationship building and making sure that you're on the same level playing field of what you're trying to achieve.
Got it. Brilliant. So you say that it's also about engaging those stakeholders in meaningful ways. So what's your, I mean, how do you, go about that? So meaningful engagement.
So when I do look at meaningful engagement, oh, did I lose you? Oh, got you back. Okay, so do you want to repeat that question, or?
Yeah, so what I've read that you've written about meaningful engagement. I see, what described, was more about how do you kind of take those stakeholders along in the journey. So if you could expand on what is meaningful engagement, how does that work?
So meaningful engagement is understanding your stakeholders' perspectives, because we have our own view on a topic or change. We have our own lens. And if you can't see it from your stakeholders' perspective, you can't relate to them. Right. And it's about relating and understanding what drives them, what their ambitions are, what they're worried about. And then you're able to engage considerately. Most people want to feel heard. I don't know if you ever had it where someone's really upset with you, and sometimes they just need to repeat what they're upset about 3 times. You just let them rant.
Right.
And once they have it out,
right,
then you can have a meaningful discussion. But the point is listening. So whether it's taking what they've said and looking at how you can fit it in, and then coming back and explaining why you can't, or it's about taking their suggestion and rethinking what's important to you and thinking, well, actually, do I have this right?
Yeah.
That response helps build the trust, and it helps make it a partnership rather than a dictatorship. Because when you're doing internal comms, you're working with a community of people.
Right.
They need to feel that they're just not being shoved along a route. If you can get them to choose to be there, it makes your life easier, and it helps them embrace what's happening, and then they become the advocates you want.
Great. And I know when you spoke about the 2x2 matrix, and you were speaking more on the influence the stakeholders have, but how can internal communicators build influence among those stakeholders? So what do you think they should be doing?
So that one's an interesting one, because that comes up a lot in internal comms and PR about how do you become this trusted advisor. And the way I found that's worked for me, and where I've seen a change, is where when you building that relationship where you show that you're doing more than just content, you're asking that question of why are we doing this? How is this going to achieve? Is this a risk for this? And looking at the bigger picture. And once we are able to step back from the tactical of what needs to get out, because we can get obsessed with our comms plans. Right. We have so much to do.
Exactly.
It never stops. But there's value in taking a step back and having that higher level conversation to ensure that what you're doing isn't a waste of time or a waste of their time. Because unless you have that strategic discussion, you end up having reactive comms that people feel is doing something because it's doing something, rather than actually seeing a value come from it or measuring the impact. And the more we move away from being seen as content pushers and into more of the how does this message help us achieve our goal, and also making sure we take jargon out of messaging, because the more jargon there is, the less repeatable and memorable it is. It's that making sense of comms to our leaders so they understand the value is the most important step in taking them along the journey.
Great, brilliant. And you mentioned briefly about listening as a key skill. Now, what do you think is the role, or how can people be more strategic in their listening?
So it can be about knowing the right people, understanding the people that you know who are going to be honest with you about what's going on and have their ear to the ground. So you have the managing upwards with the leaders and figuring out what's important to them and what they're worried about and why they want to do something. And then you have the people on the ground who are taking the change, taking the impact, taking the policy that's a rollout, and how they feel about it and how that relates to them. So in some ways, we are translators between the leadership and those on the ground,
right,
and making the two meet. There was one book I read, Beyond the Babel, that talks about on strategy communication. What was interesting was that the objective of the leadership and what drove the leadership was different than what drove the people on the ground. However, both what drove the people on the ground still helped the leadership attain their goal because it was about delivering customer service. The people on the ground didn't care about customer service. They liked to solve problems. They were engineers. But by giving them an environment and the messaging that allowed them to feel that they were succeeding, they still delivered customer service, which the leadership wanted. So it's about thinking outside of what we think good looks like and what the leadership thinks good looks like, to finding a solution that helps motivate and messaging that supports what drives the people who are actually doing the work.
Great. That's a great point. And as we wrap up, Rebecca, I just want to ask you, what's your advice for internal communicators and when they think about investing more in stakeholder management?
So similarly to how comms is seen, how people see us comms people as fluffy stuff that doesn't drive anything. Sometimes we can feel that conversations are a waste of time because we're like, we have so much more to do. But those conversations are valuable, and they're our side of fluffy.
Right.
So as much as we can think, we don't have time for that coffee, we don't have time for this, those relationship building exercises are key to successful stakeholder management. Brilliant.
This has been fantastic, Rebecca. Thank you so much for taking the time to share these insights. I really like your energy and bubbly nature which you bring. I'm sure that's what your stakeholders must be loving about you. So thank you again for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It has been great.